Hello, good evening and welcome to the latest in our series, The Chancellor's Conversations, and a big thank you to so many of you for making the effort to come here tonight and actually making the series a success. We have one more after tonight with Robert Wyatt in this series, and we'll have a new series starting in the new academic year. Now, tonight's guest is simply just a very great storyteller. In the 1990s, he was tipped by Granta as one of the best young British novelists. He had his first big hit, as many of you will remember, with Captain Corelli's Mandolin, and a few years later, perhaps well known for My Money, one of the finest novels by a British writer in recent years, a novel, it seems to me, of almost Tolstoyan in its scope, Birds Without Wings. Short stories, poetry, music, and his most recent novel, The Dust That Falls from Dreams, have all followed. Please, will you welcome Louis de Bernières. Now, let's begin a bit of biographical detail. I mean, are you a man of Kent or a Kentish man? You have Kentish roots in a way, don't you?
I sort of had Kentish roots in the sense that my grandmother and her parents had a house in Eltham, which was still Kent then. And for 4 or 5 years, I lived in Orpington, in a house called The Beeches, I think 54 Mayfield Avenue. And Orpington was technically Kent once upon a time, wasn't it? But whether that makes me a man of Kent or a Kentish man, I'm not clear.
I always get that wrong, so I'm not going to try to. In terms of writing, I mean, as a child, were you bookish? Did you write? Did you attempt to write short stories, poetry, that sort of thing?
I was very bookish. I'm actually short-sighted in my left eye from reading with the torch under the eiderdown. And one of the wonderful things about getting old is that my eyesight is getting longer. And my optician says my eyesight's improving all the time. But
or your arms are getting longer.
No, so I was very bookish. My father would have been a poet if the Second World War hadn't sent him off course. He writes very good poetry. He's 92 now. And he says he's got one poem left in him. He writes old-fashioned poetry of the kind you'd associate with John Masefield or Walter de la Mare or John Betjeman. So he understands metre and rhyme schemes and things like that. So I get it from him partly. And my mother was very literary as well. Because they were in the army and being posted all over the world, they belonged to a book club that would send you a book wherever you were. And these books, these post-war books, mainly from the 50s and early 60s, ended up obviously on their bookshelves, and those were the books that I grew up reading. They would put a brown paper cover on any book that had sex in it. So we children knew straight away which ones to go for.
Well, that's funny, because I went to a very old-fashioned school in Scotland and did quite a bit of classics. And if you wanted to read the Greek in translation, you knew the sexy bits were all the bits that were translated from Greek into Latin. Which I always thought was a great encouragement by our teachers for us to learn Latin, because you knew what... Anyway, in terms of encouragement to write, I mean, was there a teacher? Was it your parents? Was it just you?
Okay, it was my father mainly, because he's the kind of dad who recites Shakespeare at the Sunday lunch. Like the speech of Henry V before the siege of Harfleur, and Polonius's advice to Laertes and things like that. He knows all of those off by heart. And I was very lucky with a series of English teachers. I went to a Dickensian prep school in Birchington, which was called Grenham House. And all that's left of it now is a road called Grenham Road. But one of the headmasters was a pedophile and the other was a sadist. And I very, very much preferred the pedophile because at least he liked us, But the education there was pretty damn good. And I had one teacher called Ben Adams, who was extremely tall, and he used to make us write a story every week. He used to make us memorize proverbs and wise sayings and things. We'd have competitions to memorize these things. where he was really rapid fire, and you would end up at the top of the class if you were good. So he made us memorize a poem every week. We wrote a story every week. We had to write essays as well. And I think he got me into the habit of, for example, memorizing poetry, which I still have today. If I love a poem, I memorize it. I think it's a great shame that, although it has come back into primary schools recently, Michael Gove started telling people to memorize poetry, and I thoroughly agree with him. So I had that teacher who was extraordinary. He was, I'm told, kicked out for telling one of the parents what the school was really like. Then I went to a school in Berkshire where I had two masters who were quite different from each other. One's now a famous music critic called Richard Osborne, who specialises in Rossini. But back then, when I was at school, he was this super cool young man who got us to read all of these people who just weren't on the syllabus, like T.S. Eliot and D.H. Lawrence. And I think he got kicked out for being too modern. But I owe him an awful lot, a big intellectual debt. And I had another teacher called Charlie Lepper who had been an actor in Stratford with the Royal Shakespeare Company, and he started to go deaf. He thought he couldn't be an actor if he was deaf. So he thought he'd try being a schoolmaster, which actually strikes me as even madder. But he didn't go as deaf as he suspected, but he loved teaching, so he never went back to acting. But he was the kind of teacher who would act out. Let's say we were doing Othello. 1 minute he'd be Othello making Desdemona dying on her bed, and then the next minute it'd be Othello making his speech, set you down this, that in Aleppo once, when a malignant and a turbaned Turk beat a Venetian have traduced the state. There took I by the throat the circumcised dog and smote him thus. And Charlie Lepper would slit his own throat and fall on the floor. He was just brilliant. And he taught us Jane Austen and George Eliot and all these writers that I still love. And he said something very important to me, which was that it's no good just reading things that were written in English. If you want to consider yourself literate, you have to read literature from all over the world. He said you've got to read Tolstoy, you've got to read Flaubert, you've got to read Balzac, you've got to read Cervantes. And I took that very seriously, and so all my life I have read things from all over the world, and I think it sort of shows in the way that I write.
Where did the music come in? I mean, was it a musical family as well?
My mother could play by ear. She never had a music lesson in her life. She used to play what we used to call Negro spirituals. You're probably not allowed to call them that anymore. She used to play spirituals on the piano. And really, really sad things about slaves dying. And she would make them all sound like ragtime, really jolly. And my grandmother had a piano, and I wouldn't go to sleep until she had played the old folks at home on the piano.
And because you were saying to me earlier, you've got a sore hand because you've been playing the guitar so much in the last...
I've got a lifetime of playing the guitar, and my left hand really hurts all the time, but I'm not going to stop. I think I've worn out the joint down here.
No, there is one thing from your biography which I feel I have to check. Were you or were you not a cowboy in Colombia?
Yes.
Anything else you'd like to tell us about being a cowboy in Colombia? Were you a good cowboy?
Yes, I'm a good shot with a lasso. And there are two separate ways of using a lasso, for example. There's the kind where you make a loop, that's for short distances, and you just drop it over the steer's head. And there's another kind where you make a long thing. It has to be exactly the right length. And when you throw it, it straightens out, the loop closes up, and it should, if you're lucky, it lands around the horse's neck or the steer's neck. And the South American horses are very clever. They're much cleverer than ours. Our horses are bred to be stupid, but South American ones... Well, ours are bred to be beautiful and stupid. The South American ones are bred to be ugly and clever. And they actually know, when you wind the rope around the pommel, they know they've got to lean against the thing. It was tremendous fun. I was teaching in the mornings and working on the ranch in the afternoon, so you could say I was a part-time cowboy, really.
Or a part-time teacher.
I had 3 horses.
Did you?
Yes, it was like you might have 3 different kinds of motorbike. One was for going on picnics, and the other one was for going really fast. And the other one was a huge horse that was terribly powerful, and that's what you go out and catch the bull with. But you had to catch the horses before you could do it. Because the horses were half wild. The horses were half wild. So you'd spend half the afternoon catching the damn horses before you could go out and do any work.
In terms of your writing career, everybody
Yes.
will remember, as I said before, Captain Corelli. It was a big breakthrough. I mean, before that, how were you doing? I mean, did you ever think, I'm not really making it? Or, I mean, what kept you going?
No, on the contrary. I gave up being a school teacher when I was earning the same writing as I was by being a teacher. And that was before Corelli was published. This was a long time ago, of course, but I realised that I'd earned £10,000, and that was as much as I was earning as a teacher. So I thought, okay, I'm off. Some other poor bugger can have my job. I was at that time working at a truancy centre in Battersea, which I'd helped to set up. So we actually had a little school for kids who wouldn't go to school. So you imagine what a fiasco that was.
Did lassoing come into it at all?
It should have done. Half of them didn't turn up. We dreaded it when we had baked potatoes for lunch because they'd be hurled out of the windows at passers-by. Recently, one of my little truants got in touch with me saying she wants a truant reunion. I thought on Facebook, and I wondered how many of them would actually show up.
Sounds like a Monty Python sketch, that actually, doesn't it? Captain Corelli itself, were you surprised the way it took off?
It never happened suddenly, so I didn't have an opportunity to be surprised. It's true that it was a word-of-mouth book. It just sold more and more and more in a very incremental way, entirely by word of mouth. And I was looking at these royalty checks coming in thinking, oh, blimey. And then eventually the national media noticed that it was a word-of-mouth success, and they actually spoilt the word of mouth by writing about the word of mouth. But when the media suddenly noticed, that's when it sort of took off in a big way. And it happened over a period of 3 or 4 years. So I never had a horrific shock, let's say, of the person who was Mr. Nobody and got a #1 hit record. So there was never a chance for me to go completely bonkers.
Can we talk a little bit about your writing technique? Because I'm very interested in this. I mean, the way in which in Birds Without Wings or Corelli, your style of seems to me a bit like designing a diamond with different facets, different people, not just people actually, but tell bits of the story, and then you get to see the whole. So how do you shape that? Because it seems to me you could do it in quite different ways. I mean, obviously there's a chronology going through your books, but given that you've got different points of view, you could do it in some different ways. How do you decide? How do you write? Do you write chapter by chapter and then organise, or what?
I write whichever bit I feel like, and then organise it at the end when I've got a huge heap.
And how do you do that? I mean, you sort of literally a huge heap.
A huge heap. You print out all the chapters. Because I tend to follow different strings of narrative. And you have to spread these narratives evenly through the book so that it all ends up in the right place. So it's quite important to get the pacing right. And for example, with Captain Corelli, I wrote all the chapters about the war in Albania in one go. And then I went on to something else. And at the end of Birds Without Wings, I did have a massive heap of paper, and what I did was I emptied out the living room and I put all these stories in rows on the floor, and I just walked amongst these rows, sorting these stories into what seemed like a sensible order. Then I read through that heap, and I did alterations to make it all fit together better. And I did that with The Dust That Falls from Dreams as well.
In terms of Birds Without Wings, for those not familiar with it, I mean, it's set after World War I, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. It's set in a fictitious Turkish village, but actually based on the village of Kayaköy, is that right?
Yes.
Which does exist, and it's a ghost village.
Yeah.
And it was full of Greeks who left in the great rather horrible population transfer between what's now Greece and what's now Turkey. What strikes me about that book, and actually I suppose Captain Corelli as well, is you take people that are sometimes seen, particularly under Western eyes, as being the wrong side of history. You know, somebody who's fighting for Mussolini. The Turks, they were cruel to the Greeks, and sometimes the Greeks were cruel to the Turks too. And I think that's a very, very remarkable achievement, actually, in terms of Birds Without Wings, to bring alive the kind of human cost of that great conflict, which none of the people there were particularly responsible for. I mean, how did you go about researching that period and that area, which is near Fethiye in southern Turkey, isn't it?
Gosh, if I can sort of swing back a tiny bit, I have a medieval theory of human nature, which is that we're all part beast and part angel. And so I try not to have characters who are entirely good or entirely bad. There's a very sympathetic character called Iskander the Potter in Birds Without Wings. I think I'm right in saying that he gets sort of accidentally caught up in the stoning of a woman. And the Imam says, "You're a Christian, go away." But so it might have been Constantinos, I don't know. But anyway, I try to have characters who are neither completely good nor completely bad, because that's how we are. And the way we behave often depends upon external circumstance, what pressures we're under. You know, whether we're under orders, for example, whether we're more frightened of making beasts of ourselves or more frightened of the commander who's going to shoot us if we don't do what we're told. But to get back to the end of your question, how do you do the research? Well, gosh, it happens in all sorts of different ways. I went to that place, to Kayakoi, several times. I walked around it a great deal, making notes. And if you observe a place carefully, you can tell how life was. So in Kayakoi, it's a stone town up a hillside. The largest houses are at the top, so that's clearly where the wealthiest people lived. They had the best air up there, I suppose. All the houses had systems for collecting water off the roof into large cisterns on the side of the house. The houses all had a nice outside loo on one corner, with an interesting, sort of intricate little entrance so people couldn't spy on you. The streets are only wide enough for donkeys and camels, so you would have known there would be no carts there. There were 2 Greek Orthodox churches, so there must have been Greek clergymen. There was 1 mosque, so there must have been an imam. The locals say there weren't any Armenians there, but I know there were. And there certainly would have been Jews there. There's a pottery which is still working, and it's still working in the way that the pottery used to work back in the day. There's a large meydan, or town square, and much of Turkish life still takes place in the town square. And at the entrance to the town, there's a water fountain which was put in by a Greek philanthropist, and his inscription is up there. So you can work, and you can just see traces of paint on what's left of the shutters and so on. So you can even tell what colour everything was. The houses weren't concrete ruins as they are now. They were all stone ruins. They were painted in cheerful colours. So after going there often enough, I had a very firm idea of what it was like. And then you have to notice things, like one time I went in and there was a lady making flatbread by spinning it on a stick. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but it's absolutely, it's marvellous. I said, it was like a miracle. But, you know, this woman got embarrassed with me watching and she skipped indoors. But, or for example, you see capers growing out of the walls. You know, for us, capers are things in glass bottles soaked in vinegar. But in Turkey, it's a lovely fleshy plant that grows out of the cracks of walls. It's a question of noticing things, really, and also being curious and being prepared to ask people questions, because people honestly are often very interested in being helpful, particularly in Turkey. A great many Turks are very, very enthusiastic amateur historians. And I had the most terrific help from Turkish historians when I was writing about Gallipoli from the Turkish point of view. We could go on to Gallipoli, perhaps.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, we're just 100 years and a bit after Gallipoli.
Yeah.
And you do write about it from the Turkish point of view. And you explained to me, when I read your book, when I read this one of your books, it made me want to learn more about Kemal Atatürk, Mustafa Kemal, who is an extraordinary figure, and he's
Yeah.
one of the characters in your book, one of the narrators in your book. Tell us a bit about that.
Mustafa Kemal helped me out with a bad problem. I wanted readers to get a proper understanding of the history behind all of this, and I couldn't think of how to do it without actually writing overt history lessons, the way that, for example, Tolstoy might have been tempted to do. And then I realized that Mustafa Kemal, who became Ataturk, had been everywhere where anything interesting happened. So all I had to do was give a potted biography of Mustafa Kemal, and I would give the reader the history surreptitiously. Right, so that's why he's in there. And a lot of Turks have told me that I've told them things that they simply didn't know about him at all. But the reason Mustafa Kemal, I mean, from my point of view, is really a remarkable character, is that, well, he was an autocrat, right? If you wanted to be unkind, you could say he was a dictator. But he wasn't interested in details the way Mussolini was. Mussolini wanted to tell people what kind of shoelaces they should have in their army boots. Mustafa Kemal left all of that to other people. He wanted to stay up all night drinking raka and talking about big ideas. And he's the only dictator in history who wanted his country to get smaller. Right? He didn't want the Ottoman Empire. He didn't want those Arabs and Serbs and Bulgarians and things. He just wanted it to be smaller. He wanted it to be in the Anatolian heartland. Secondly, he's the only dictator in the history of the world who thought that the sole purpose of his dictatorship was to set up a functioning democracy. So he even set up his own opposition party. And when it didn't oppose him efficiently, he abolished it and started another one.
Although, to be fair, the Conservatives are doing that today.
Yes. Yes, that's true, yeah. So,
as we were discussing a little earlier, actually.
Yeah, and he wanted to set up a sort of a normal, liberal Western democracy. Turkey was the first country, I think they introduced the vote for women before we did. So, you know, Mustafa Kemal has a lot to be said for him. A most unusual dictator.
Let's move on to, I've got some questions that we get questions that are tweeted, emailed, and all kinds of ways. So thank you for those. A couple that come in. I like this one particularly. I studied your book, Captain Corelli, at A-level. What do you feel is your moral centre point of that novel? Would the person who's got an essay due on this subject put their hands up? Because it's very enterprising. Anyway.
Are they here?
I don't know.
Is the guilty party here? Because I used to get letters from people saying, I really loved your book, Captain Corelli's Mandolin. Could you explain to me your use of simile and metaphor?
I think we'll move on from that one. Do you ever get writer's block? How do you cope? I mean, you're very busy. Do you ever
I'm very busy because I've realized that the secret of happiness, or at least the secret of not being melancholy, is being busy. I've absolutely no doubt about that at all. So I'm always busy, but not always with writing. I don't get writer's block because if I don't feel like writing, I don't even try. Elizabeth Jane Howard used to sit in front of her desk every morning, starting at 9 o'clock, and just sit there rigid with fear and anxiety. When she should have just gone out shopping. Esther Freud once told me that a writer is writing all the time. And I think that's true. You know, you can be out, if you want to write poetry, for example, you can't do better than go for a walk, but because the rhythm of your feet will set up that iambic or trochaic meter. Old-fashioned trains were brilliant for that too. Modern silent trains are absolute crap for writing poetry in.
Do you write in your head then? I mean, you go for a walk and you write? Yeah.
Yes,
and then
yes. The only poem of mine that I've memorized came to me when I was driving, and I couldn't stop and note it down. But I can be out on the golf course, to be honest, and I'm thinking about what Mr. McCosh is going to do in Volume 3. I don't see why I had to sit at home in agony and do it.
But you sit at home writing, thinking about the golf course?
Not really.
Not really.
No,
I didn't think that
really,
somehow.
Not really.
How critical have editors been to your literary output? Critical to, rather than critical of?
Not critical of, right. critical too. Very, I think. I owe a lot to my editors, but it rather depends on the book. So, for example, I just had to write a little book in a rush for the Australians, which is set in Australia. And I insisted on having an Australian editor so that they can make sure I didn't make any stupid Anglo mistakes. I had an editor called John Blackwell who was an encyclopedia. And when I sent in the draft for Captain Corelli's Mandolin, he sent me a note saying, Italian Jeeps did not have that kind of suspension. You know, amazing. Wow. Yes. He used to send me little notes on how to mend cracks in guitars, and everything. Extraordinary man. But he died, unfortunately, and the editor I have now is extremely conscientious, and he's very, very good at spotting anomalies. And he also does what the previous editor did, which was not so much suggest what to take out, but suggest what more to put in. So with the troublesome offspring of Cardinal Guzman, my editor John, the Jeep expert, he said, the Cardinal and his mistress are out of the story for too long. You've got to give them an extra strand of narrative. So I very gladly did that. It's always very unpleasant being told to take stuff out. And being a literary writer, I'm entitled to say no. But being told to put more in is really quite nice.
How do you feel your writing has changed over time? If you could, what advice would you give to yourself when you started writing? That's an interesting question.
I've got lots of advice for myself when young. One is, if you don't put anything in, you get nothing out. You've got to read a lot. You can't be a writer unless you read a lot. You particularly can't write poetry unless you read poetry a lot. We're very like computers. If you put nothing in, you get nothing out. You put rubbish in, you get rubbish out. You put good stuff in, you get good stuff out. It's as simple as that. You've got to be a reader to be a writer. Secondly, you tend to write the same kinds of things as you read. So if you read a lot of thrillers, you're inevitably going to start writing thrillers. If you read nothing but poetry, you will probably write nothing but poetry. And in my case, I for most of my life, I've been reading literary fiction. And through my 20s and early 30s, I was reading nothing but literary fiction from Latin America. And that explains an awful lot about my writing. Since my reading has broadened, my style has changed quite a lot. I think that's probably my practical advice to one's young self.
And you read the Latin American authors in Spanish. Do you read French?
I can read French, yes.
Yeah. And have you tried to have a look at your own translations when you were translated into Spanish, for example? I mean, are you interested in that? Or is that... Because I know some authors get very cross. I know particularly one Chinese author who's pretty fluent in English, who finds the way in which she's translated not entirely helpful.
No, I mean, a Turkish friend of mine had a book translated into English and they completely messed up the ending. They can't have understood what Zulfu had written. So I had to tell him about this. I have mainly positive experiences with translators. My translator into French is actually a Spanish lady called Fanchita Gonzalez. And she's ideal, really, because of my rather Latin American style of writing. She's got that Latin feel. And when I read what she's translated into French, the funny bits make me laugh in a way that the English funny bits don't.
That's a success. I want to throw it open to questions from the floor in a minute, but I want to talk a little bit about The Dust That Falls from Dreams, which you published last year.
Last summer, yes.
Last summer. And tell us about it. Tell us about the overall objective here, because there's 3 parts, isn't there?
I'm writing 3 volumes, I hope, if I'm spared, as my father says. But the books are designed to be read independently, like my first Latin American novels. And I got the idea, really, because I have quite an interesting family history. My grandmother lost a fiancé in 1915, and she was utterly devoted to him, and because he was killed in France, she never really got a chance to become disillusioned with him. She'd never had a quarrel with him, and he remained her ideal man. So when she married my grandfather in 1918, it wasn't destined for glory. They had a very difficult marriage. I won't go into the details. But over the decades, my grandfather progressively disappeared until he disappeared altogether in the 50s. And we'd assumed that he was dead, just, you know. And then, not all that long ago, a solicitor knocked on our door to inform us that he died in the Rocky Mountains at the age of 96 in Canada, and that he'd been working as a night watchman on a quarry which belonged to the Similkameen Indians. And I went to Canada to find out more about him and to find out what he'd been up to and to get his version of the story. And I came back with a lot of really interesting stuff and quite a lot of mementos, of things left over from the Royal Flying Corps. And I decided back then, this is a long time ago, about 1994, that one day I was going to write a family saga, but I knew I wasn't ready for it in the past. It's actually fantastically difficult to write a family saga. And I very strongly regret that Elizabeth Jane Howard has died because I can't get her advice now. She lived very close to me. One of the problems with family sagas is that if they go on for long enough, everybody dies. So it's just a catalogue of deaths, you know. I think I've got to let some people just fade out. So I wanted to write a family saga, but I didn't want it to be actually about my family because I didn't know enough about the truth of it. And in any case, the purpose of fiction isn't to tell the literal truth, it's to tell metaphorical truth or poetic truth or virtual truth, isn't it? So, for example, the person in the book who would have been my grandmother, I've given her 3 sisters, and she didn't have 3 sisters, you know. I've made the grandfather character into a flying ace, and he was actually an observer. So I've made I've told as many whoppers as I possibly can, but just because the story has to grow up and win independence. Mm. I'm hoping to end it in about 1980, and I've written the last chapter of the last volume, so I know what I'm aiming at.
But did you write, am I right in thinking you did not write the first bit and then go on to the second and the third, that you've been writing bits of all 3 simultaneously? Is that right?
Yes, that's my policy of writing whatever turns up. You can't say, oh, I'm going to write that in 5 years' time, because in 5 years' time it will have gone. You don't even understand your own notebooks after 5 years. I always carry a notebook. I've probably got one. Yeah, I've got this one. But you can very, very easily make notes which you think are completely coherent and will remind you. And then you read them a few days later. You probably can't even read your handwriting, and then you don't know what the notes are supposed to mean.
But how?
Look, I can't read this. Dozens of little. Can you read that? No.
Is it Turkish? I don't know. No. But then how resilient is if you're writing like that and then you come back to it 6 months' time, you've got a chapter, sort of, and you go back to it. Do you look at it and go, oh dear, or do you think, yeah, that does stand up, or that needs a lot of work? I mean, presumably it's different in different occasions, but does it last?
If something doesn't stand up, I just leave it longer. Which reminds me, years ago you said you were going to write a novel.
I managed to write a couple, yeah, but I didn't get Penelope Cruz to star in any of mine.
Well, I didn't get her to either.
No, I know. What did you think of the film of Captain Corelli?
Well, the soundtrack was amazing. Really good. And the cinematography was amazing. Mm. And meeting Penelope Cruz was one of the nicest things that's ever happened to me, because she's adorable. But I had been hoping for a European film with European values, which is why I sold it to Working Title, which is really British and with French money, I think. But they decided they were going to go full tilt for a Hollywood film, really. And that's why they got Nick Cage in, who I think is a great actor, and I've loved a lot of his films, especially Wild at Heart. I love that film, I don't know if you remember it. But I was envisaging Captain Corelli as a lively little Italian, not at all lugubrious American. And to do him credit, there wasn't any much wrong with what he did. I mean, he even learned to play the mandolin. He really did.
Did he?
He really did learn to play the mandolin, yes. But But I think I was actually most annoyed by a completely spurious sex scene in the olive grove in the middle of the film, where Corelli and Pelagia have sex, and then he just buggers off. I don't know about you, with Penelope Cruz, I would have come back. Anyway. Anyway, it can only have been because the director wanted to see her with no clothes on. It didn't make any narrative sense. And of course, they gave it a happy ending, which I knew they would, or a happier ending. I wasn't so bothered about that. I think it was a film that was great in parts. So, for example, the bit where they massacre the young Italian troops was done in the place where it happened and in the manner that it really did happen. That was historically very, very accurate, and you could still find cartridge cases lying around there. And I found that particular scene where they massacred the young Italians was heartbreaking, and the whole film was worth it just for that. I also think it's a film that will improve with age.
Rather like the bits that you didn't like when you wrote them and you come back to them.
Yes.
Let's have some questions from the floor if people would like to start. I think there's a gentleman there and a gentleman here. Have we got any microphones? Yes. And then there's a gentleman in the front row.
Hi. Have you ever lost a piece of work by a goat or a capricious computer, and it's actually enhanced your work?
Have I lost work?
Yeah. In Captain Corelli's Mandolin, the doctor loses some work by the goat, but has that happened to you?
Yes. Well, the worst thing that happened to me was writing a film script on a word processor, because my first book was handwritten and my next four were done on a word processor with a tiny little black screen with green writing, and I called it Esmeralda. And I loved it, but I had to print out every page with a daisy wheel. And I was writing a film script, and I put too much on for the machine to remember. And the machine just crashed, and it lost the whole script. And I was so depressed, I just went to bed. I couldn't think what else to do. I went to bed and shut down for a few hours because it was the most miserable experience. And another time, I put up a writing shed at the end of my garden in my house in Norfolk, because I was trying to write without distractions. You know, I had a tiny little boy, and my ex didn't like me to be on my own either. So I was down in the corner, and in this little corner of my garden, I had it powered by a solar panel with a car battery and an inverter to turn it from 12 volts to 220, etc. It was all beautifully engineered by me, and I stupidly left my laptop in there. And I was writing A Partisan's Daughter. I got 50 pages into A Partisan's Daughter when someone broke into my tool shed, and with my pitchfork, because you need one of these in Norfolk, with my pitchfork they prized open my writing shed, and they stole my laptop. So I lost the first part of this novel, which wasn't going to be a long novel anyway. And that was pretty gutting. And I thought, oh, well, I just got to start again, haven't I? But I didn't do anything for 3 months. And then I got rung up by Bungay police station. What had happened was that the thief had slung my laptop into a ditch in a place called Ersham, which is a very glamorous part of the Norfolk Alps. And they slung it into a ditch, and this guy had found it covered with algae, and he handed it, okay, the theft was in Norfolk, he handed it into the police station in Bungay, which is in Suffolk. Now, you may not know that the different counties in Britain, the police forces do not talk to each other. They don't coordinate. So you can murder somebody in Ersham, right? If you live in Bungay, you won't get caught, because that's in Suffolk. So anyway, eventually, the police station in Bungay decided to sell it by auction, right? And the police force in Bungay consists of one old part-time lady. right? So the old part-time lady thought, well, before we send it for auction, I'll open it up and see who it might belong to. So she fired it up and realized it was mine, and I got it back, complete with a lot of very embarrassing emails. and my first 50 pages of A Partisan's Daughter. So that's rather a long answer to your question, but I do find something's benefit by being left a long time, especially poems. Things you wrote when you were a teenager should definitely be rewritten when you're 60.
I think that was what W.B. Yeats did, actually, if you look at his work. But anyway, yes, there was somebody down here. Gentleman here. Anybody else at the back?
I'm a film student here at this university, and one of the parts of my degree is kind of writing screenplays.
Yeah.
And it's made me realise that I love telling stories. And in fact, I've read your book recently, Gavin, about the stories that great leaders tell, and it's fascinated me. One of the questions I had was, with particular what you've written, at what stage, something that I found hard is, when do I stop? When am I happy with the product? And how do you decide when you're finished with a novel and a narrative to then get it published? And how long does it take you from start to end?
That's lots of questions.
Just two.
Well, my first 4 books took a year each. Birds Without Wings took me 10 years, but there's a good reason for that. Well, many reasons. I mean, I was coping with Captain Corelli's success. I wrote a little book, Red Dog, which I wrote for mainly for the Australians. That only took a couple of weeks. I wrote that with a laptop in the desert in Western Australia. How do you know when you've finished? Well, you definitely know when you've finished. You just feel that you have. You can either feel completely satisfied and there's no point in adding to it, or you can get another feeling which is not quite so nice, which is I just can't go on with this. With film scripts, it's much easier because you know how long the film is going to be. The producers will tell you what they want. It will be very precise about it. There's very little artistic freedom if you're a script writer. You can't, as far as I can see, put in any great dialogue. You can't put anything poetic. Filmmakers, they're not really interested in the words. They're interested in what the viewer will see. They want it visual. So, they want little things. Even if they don't use it, they want things like, an eagle flies across the top of the screen from right to left, and there's a camel. There's a cloud the shape of a camel, and they want visual details. It's very, very depressing trying to write good dialogue in a film script because it'll just get sent to somebody they call a polisher. They're a bit like what advertisers call creatives. People who would just make a complete bollocks of it. You will find out for yourself.
Yes. There was a gentleman over there. Yep.
Hello.
Hello.
You've mentioned something about reading, about the purpose of fiction as not to give truth, but rather a metaphorical truth or a virtual truth.
Yeah.
What do you think about reading fiction to have some understanding about the social reality of a certain period of time?
Well, professional academic historians will always tell you that novelists are absolutely useless for this and you shouldn't pay them any attention and they're not doing the job properly. But I think we can give a very strong sense of what it was like to be there, right? Because what you're doing is forcing the reader to imagine themselves as someone else, right? Umberto Eco, who died recently, he said the wonderful thing about reading is that I've lived thousands of lives. And this is what fiction does. You actually lead a separate life, don't you? You're in Turkey, or you're in Croydon when you actually live in Edinburgh. Do you see what I mean? So that's what I meant by virtual experience. And it's the truth, possibly, as it could have been, or even as it should have been, and probably as it was. I mean, the thing is, we're all human beings, and I don't believe the human race has really changed very much in thousands of years. We have the same emotions now that we had in the caves. And we are emotional creatures and not rational creatures. So For example, in The Dust That Falls from Dreams, I wrote about the bombing of Folkestone, where a lot of people were killed in Tontine Street when they were queuing for potatoes. And I don't feel I have any difficulty whatsoever in imagining what it was like to be there. And there's nothing in my account of that bombing which a historian could actually disagree with. But what my account does, which a historian's account doesn't do, is actually make you feel what it was like. So, at the end of that bombing, there was the head of a beautiful little child just on the doorstep of the grocer's, right? A historian may not bother to tell you that detail, but I know it was there, and I'm a novelist, so I'll put it in. And that image of a beautiful child's head on a doorstep is I think, is going to be gutting for a reader in a way that the reader of a historical work never gets gutted. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
And also you hit on the point that technologically we have changed, obviously, vastly, even in the last 10 years, never mind in the last 10,000, but morally, and the way in which humans act and treat each other, we haven't changed that much. A head on the doorstep is produced by something different in the 20th century than 1,000 years ago.
Yeah.
The same thing still.
Yeah. I think I did my degree in philosophy, so I've thought an awful lot about the nature of truth and the nature of knowledge. And there was my favourite philosopher when I was studying philosophy was very, very much disregarded and poo-pooed by the academics, and that was Arthur Schopenhauer, who was a post-Kantian. What he wrote was sort of adding to Kant. But one of Schopenhauer's great contributions to ethics, I think, was to point out that ethics has no rational basis. People had always been trying to find a rational basis for why we should behave as we do and why our moral codes should be as they are. And Schopenhauer pointed out that actually ethics depends on our natural capacity for empathy. We suffer when another suffers. It's as simple as that, right? And we know that people who don't have empathy, we call them psychopaths. So we think of them as morally sick, don't we, psychopaths? And so I'm very strongly into this idea of the author as creating empathy between the reader and the character.
I think we've got time for one or two other questions, because I want to end by talking about poetry, but and maybe get you to do a reading. Yes, lady there.
What contemporary writers do you read, and what's on your reading list now?
I'm just starting to read The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. I've only got to page 50 on the train on the way here. It's a massive book. I'm slightly frightened of its size. But it's, probably competes with that. And I tend to read lots of books simultaneously. So the weekend before this, I was in Limerick for the Limerick Literature Festival, and there was a young woman there who won the Kate O'Brien Prize called Sarah Baum. And she's written this really extraordinary story about a man of about my age who adopts a one-eyed dog. And the writing is very, very rhythmical. You could tell she ought to be writing poetry. So, and it's got a strange title, like Falter Wither. It's 4 words. Anyway, I'm reading that at the moment. But it's one of the nice things about my job is I get to meet all sorts of people from all over the world and sort of pick up odd things to read. Yeah? What are you reading?
Margaret Atwood.
Right. Fair enough. Yes, I know Margaret.
Let's talk a little bit about the poetry in the last few minutes.
Okay.
Well, actually, why don't you, have you got some that you would read? Something you could read?
I normally ask the interviewer to tell me what to read, but you may be innocent of these. I've been writing poetry all my life, and when I was young, I had a crisis of confidence because you know, let's face it, modernism had kicked in and we no longer knew what a poem was. The last time when we sort of knew what the rules were was during the Georgian period, by which I mean the time of George V, writers like Rupert Brooke and John Masefield, who were writing in recognisably modern English. They dropped all the these and thous and so on, but they were writing in recognisably modern English, but still following the rules. And then T.S. Eliot comes along, and all the rules fly out of the window, but he's writing fantastically great poetry. And it made life very difficult for those who came after. You can't imitate Eliot. If you try, it just doesn't work. So we're left in this horrible situation where you're not sure whether what you've written is actually poetry or just prose cut up. And it wasn't until about 5 years ago that I really got to grips with this. And I actually studied metrics. I made a point of... And now, because of that, I can see where my lines have gone lumpy. And it gave me the confidence to write poetry and to publish it. And I'm glad I waited until I knew how to do it, to be frank. Let me see. So, and I found as time went by that I had enough of particular types of poetry to have separate volumes. So my last volume was a sort of tribute collection to Constantine Kavafis, the Alexandrian poet, because I'd written enough in his manner. And then I realized I had enough stuff about love and desire, which I should do at my age. And some of these poems, my publishers, of course, had this brilliant idea that it should come out in time for Valentine's Day, and they put pink all over the cover. I said, come on, it's not a girl's book. And some of the poems are actually very unsuitable for Valentine's Day because they're bitter and angry. And others are much nicer. Should I do a nice one? Oh, here's one. Here's one of my favorites. Yeah. I once went to a reading on the South Bank where this poet was reading endless poems about girlfriends. And in the end, I thought, he's just boasting about the number of his lovers. I want to try and avoid giving that impression. Okay, this is called for Sylvie, who believed in reincarnation. She believed in everything, you know, crystals, the whole lot. Anyway. The news from France arrived last month that you were dead and cloaked in earth, the same dark earth your mother wears, who lies beside you silently. We loved when we were young, not well, but well enough, and questingly. We roamed about the southern hills and lay in wheat till darkness fell. You loved the ducks in English parks, the ancient crones with bags of bread. You paunched the lure of wild ideas and let them fizz inside your head. Your son arrived from France last night to look for you in those you loved. He has your eyes and could have been my own if I had not taken fright. So I've outlived and you've gone on, your body cold and cloaked in earth, deep planted in the soil of France, to wait, perhaps, your second birth. So, let me see.
Perhaps one more. Louis will be signing books outside. If you haven't read Birds Without Wings, I desperately think you should read it. And also, you may be interested in the poetry, which I'm not familiar with. Okay. One more?
This is one of the amusing ones. So they're not all about dead girlfriends. This poem was inspired by Kavafis. He once wrote a poem about a mirror, which suddenly had a beautiful young man in it, and realized that its whole existence had been to have this young man reflected in it. But this is mine about a hotel bed. It's called The Bed. What scandalous things it's seen, this king-size bed in a small hotel. Such tawdry scenes, affairs and one-night stands, infidelities, disasters, failures, bliss regretted, unattained, denied. How bored this bed is with all that meaningless grunting and heaving, the cords lashed to its bars, the terrible mess, the weeping. But now 2 gods have come disguised as no one at all, Mr. and Mrs. Grey and Forgettable. In darkness they peel their mortal skin, and the room glows gold. A rich but subtle scent seeps into curtains, sheets, pillows, and springs. They are utterly lovely, these gods who have shed their disguise. Their skin is the colour of honey of time. They are fashioned of amber light, hot as Aegean summer sand. Who can they be, these exquisite souls, ancient and perfectly young, bound together in beautiful, tremulous joy? Their eyes grow huge with desire. Their laughter is light and unashamed. The bed frame feels the shock, the thrill, the electric force, the quivering pulse of the two gods, ancient and perfectly young, attuned to their pleasure like tautened strings of a lyre. The gods have done. They dress again in their mortal skin, Mr. and Mrs. Grey and Forgettable, pay their bill and travel on to the next abode of bliss. The bed settles back on its springs. It has found at last its meaning, the purpose of all that cutting, planing, and joining. I was made, it thinks, for this. But the bed has become forlorn. It has no further purpose in this room. Its most magnificent hour has flicked away, when two young deities stepped into time, loved bright and long, loved without shame, mingled, laughed, caressed, and kissed. The bed waits. It will suffer the mortals. It will wait and remember and yearn against the day that might come to pass when the two gods, other gods, any gods, return.
With that bed's eye view, big thank you to Louis de Bernières. Thank you. Thank you, Louis. Good job. Thank you.